the fall of 1981, on a gravel road outside of Dimmitt, Texas, a 38-year-old woman named Mabel Grundy paid $2,400 for a greenhouse nobody in Castro County thought was worth saving. The structure was a disaster. The previous owner, a retired school teacher named Harlan Foss, had built it in 1967 with salvaged aluminum framing and second-hand glass panels, and by the time his daughter called the estate sale, half the panels were cracked, the heating system had not worked in 3 winters, and the irrigation lines had burst the February before and been left unrepaired because Harlan had been in a nursing home in Lubbock and nobody had thought to fix them. His daughter lived in Phoenix. She wanted it gone. Mabel heard about the Foss estate from her neighbor Gus Pelham, who had heard about it from someone at the co-op who had mentioned it in the way you mention things you expect nobody to want. Harlan Foss had been trying to grow tomatoes year-round in the Texas Panhandle in a glass greenhouse in 1967, which was either visionary or foolish depending on who you asked, and in Castro County in 1967, everybody asked had said foolish. He had never made the greenhouse work the way he intended. He had grown things in it, slowly, partially, with more failure than success. And then his hip gave out in 1978, and the structure had been sitting empty ever since. A glass and aluminum embarrassment on the south end of a property the daughter was trying to sell before Christmas. Mabel drove out on a Thursday morning in October. The daughter, a thin woman in her 40s named Peggy, was there with a real estate agent who kept checking his watch. Mabel walked the greenhouse alone for almost an hour. She tested the framing. She checked the orientation. She measured the floor space with a tape measure she had brought from home and wrote the numbers in a small notebook. She looked at the soil in the raised beds, which was compacted and pale, and had not been turned in years. She noted which panels were cracked and where, and she noted that the structure faced due south and had no shade obstruction for 200 feet in every direction. Peggy came out from the house eventually and stood at the entrance with her arms folded against the October wind. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking I'd like to buy the greenhouse." The real estate agent looked up from his clipboard. "It's included in the property listing," he said. "I know," Mabel said. "I'm not interested in the house, just the greenhouse. I'd like to disassemble it and relocate it to my property." Peggy stared at her. The real estate agent stared at her. "You want to take it apart and move it?" "Yes." Peggy looked at the agent. The agent looked at his clipboard. The greenhouse, in its current state, was actually a liability in the property listing because the buyer would have to pay to demolish it or restore it, and neither option was cheap. Peggy had been advised by 2 different contractors that removal alone would run close to $800. "What are you offering?" Peggy asked. $2,400 for the structure, the framing, all the remaining glass panels, the irrigation hardware, and that pile of 4-inch clay pots behind the east wall. Peggy said yes before Mabel finished the sentence. Mabel drove home and called her son-in-law, a contractor named Ted, and told him to find 2 strong men and a flatbed. Her foreman, if you could call him that. He was really her husband's old ranch hand, a broad-shouldered man of 60 named Clem Doherty, who had stayed on after Raymond died in 1977, was standing in the yard when Mabel pulled back in. Clem had worked for the Grundy family for 19 years. He had watched Raymond Grundy run 1,200 acres of dryland cotton and sorghum with patience and good sense, and he had watched Mabel take over the operation after Raymond's heart attack with the kind of quiet competence that made you realize competence. She had been running it alongside Raymond for years, and nobody had fully noticed. He watched her get out of the truck with her notebook and that particular look on her face that meant she had already decided something. "What did you buy?" he asked. "A greenhouse." Clem took off his cap. He looked at the flat brown horizon. "What kind of greenhouse?" "Glass and aluminum. About 40 feet by 60. Where are you going to put it?" "South side of the equipment barn. I already measured. It fits." Clem put his cap back on. He had been a cotton man his whole life. His father had been a cotton man. His grandfather had come to the Panhandle in 1912 with nothing but a mule, and the conviction that flat land and hard wind were all a man needed to grow something worthwhile. In Clem Doherty's world, you grew cotton in Castro County. You grew sorghum if cotton prices were bad. You did not buy broken greenhouses from dead schoolteachers. "Miss Mabel," he said, carefully, "what in the world are you planning to grow in a greenhouse in the middle of dryland cotton country?" Mabel looked at him. "I'll tell you when it's working." Clem said nothing else. He had learned from Raymond that certain statements Mabel made were not invitations to discuss. By November, the greenhouse was reassembled on the south wall of the equipment barn. Ted had patched 14 cracked panels with salvaged glass he found at a salvage yard in Hereford. The irrigation lines had been rerun with half-inch PVC. Mabel had brought in 6 yards of compost from a feedlot outside of Plainview and worked it into the raised beds herself over 3 weekends. The heating system was new, a propane unit she had bought second-hand from a nursery in Amarillo that was upgrading its equipment. The whole project had cost her, when she added everything together, just under $4,000. For a woman running 1,200 acres of dryland crops on a budget that left her roughly $1,800 in the bank at the end of most years. It was not a small amount. Her neighbor to the east, a cotton farmer named Bert Ashby, drove by in December and stopped at the fence line to look at the greenhouse gleaming in the winter sun. "What are you doing over there, Mabel?" he called. "Growing things," she called back. In December, especially in December. Bert shook his head and drove on, but it was a dry July. By the time he reached the co-op that afternoon, the story was already half-formed in the telling. Mabel Grundy had bought some broke-down greenhouse from Harlan Foss's estate, moved it to her place, fixed it up, and was growing something in it in the middle of winter. In December, in Castro County, where the wind came in from New Mexico at 40 miles an hour and the temperature dropped to 18 degrees on a regular Tuesday night. The story got funnier every time it was told. You have to understand who Mabel Grundy was, because what she did with that greenhouse over the next 8 years only makes sense if you understand where the idea came from and how long she had been waiting to try it. Mabel was born in 1943 in Dimmitt, the second of 4 children born to a Agan farmer named Earl Swick and his wife Ruth, who kept a kitchen garden behind the house that produced more food per square foot than most people in the county thought was possible. Ruth Swick had a gift for soil. She amended it constantly, composted everything, rotated her vegetables by instinct, and produced tomatoes in August that her neighbors talked about like they were a minor miracle. Mabel had learned to garden by following through that kitchen plot from the time she could walk, and she had absorbed something that most people in dryland farming country never learned, that the difference between good soil and dead soil was not rain. It was management. She had married Raymond Grundy in 1962, when she was 19. Raymond was a good man and a capable farmer, steady and methodical, the kind of man who checked the weather report twice and planted by the almanac and kept his equipment in perfect repair. He had inherited the 1,200 acres from his father and ran it the way his father had, which was the way most men in Castro County ran their operations. Dryland cotton, dryland sorghum, one income stream, one weather bet, one crop cycle per year. Mabel had farmed alongside Raymond for 15 years without ever quite saying what she thought about single-crop, dryland farming, which was that it was a beautiful way to go broke slowly. The margins were thin. The weather was unreliable. A hailstorm in July could take out an entire year's work in 20 minutes. Cotton prices were set in markets that had nothing to do with Castro County and everything to do with decisions made in offices in Memphis and Houston and Shanghai. Raymond had known all of this and had farmed anyway, because what else were you going to do with 1,200 acres of flat Texas Panhandle ground? When Raymond died in October 1977, Mabel was 34 years old with 2 teenage children, a paid-off mortgage, 1,200 acres of dryland crops, and a growing conviction that she was going to have to figure out a different way to use this land. She had been reading for years, not the Texas Extension Service publications, which mostly confirmed what Raymond had always done. She had been reading university research papers from California, from the Netherlands, from Israel, from places where water was scarce and land was expensive, and farmers had been forced by necessity to figure out how to produce more from less. She had been particularly interested in controlled environment agriculture, greenhouses, high tunnels, season extension, and what it could do for a small farming operation in a place with brutal winters and brutal summers and 11 inches of rain in a good year. The numbers she had worked out in her notebook over 3 years before she ever heard Harlan Foss's name were straightforward. A properly managed 40 by 60 greenhouse in the Texas Panhandle could produce fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, and leafy greens from October through May, the exact months when no fresh local produce existed within 150 miles of Dimmitt. The nearest commercial greenhouse operation was in Lubbock, and it served wholesale buyers. There was no one selling fresh, locally grown produce at retail prices to the grocery stores, the schools, the hospital, and the restaurants in Castro County and the 3 counties around it. Not because there was no demand, because nobody had tried. That was what Mabel saw when she drove out to Harlan Foss's broken greenhouse on a Thursday in October 1981. Not a liability, not a demolition problem. A piece of infrastructure that someone had built in exactly the right orientation, in exactly the right county, and then failed to use correctly for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the idea was sound. The idea was sound. She had known it for 3 years. Harlan Foss's death had provided the greenhouse. Let Mabel tell you about the first 2 winters, because this is where stubbornness and good soil science are worth more than experience and a cooperative bank. She planted in November 1981. Tomatoes in the east beds, 3 varieties, staked on a simple string trellis. She built from conduit pipe and baling wire. Butterhead lettuce in the west beds. 2 rows of spinach along the north wall where the light was weakest. Cucumbers along the south-facing glass where they would get the most direct winter sun. Clem came in the 2nd week of December and stood at the door of the greenhouse looking at the seedlings in their rows with the expression of a man who has decided to withhold judgment for the time being. "They're alive," he said. "They are. It was 9 degrees last night. I know." The propane unit held at 58. Clem nodded slowly. He looked at the tomato seedlings. "How long before those produce?" "February, if they set properly." Clem looked at her. He looked at the seedlings. He looked at the propane unit on the north wall. "How much does it cost to run that heater all night?" "Less than it costs to leave the money in the bank," Mabel said, "which is where I was keeping it before." Clem had nothing to say to that. He left and came back the next morning because he wanted to see how the plants had held overnight, and then he came back the morning after that, and somewhere around the 3rd week of December, he began stopping in every morning without being asked checking the temperature log. Mabel kept on a clipboard by the door, looking at the plants with the careful eye of a man who had spent 40 years watching things grow. In February 1982, Mabel Grundy harvested her first tomatoes from that greenhouse. They were not large, they were not perfect, but they were red and ripe, and they smelled the way a tomato is supposed to smell, which is a thing that a grocery store tomato in the Texas Panhandle in February does not smell like, because a grocery store tomato in February has been picked green somewhere in Florida or Mexico and gassed with ethylene and driven 2,000 miles in a refrigerated truck and placed on a shelf under fluorescent lights and has forgotten somewhere in that process what it was supposed to be. Mabel took a flat of 12 tomatoes to the manager of the Piggly Wiggly in Dimmitt on a Tuesday morning. His name was Glenn, and he had been managing that store for 11 years and had never once been offered locally grown produce in the winter, because there was no locally grown produce in the winter, because nobody in Castro County grew anything in the winter, because it was February in the Texas Panhandle and sensible people did not try. Glenn looked at the tomatoes. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "My greenhouse," she said. "South side of my equipment barn on Farm Road, 1055. "You grew these? In February?" "Yes." Glenn picked one up. He smelled it. He looked at Mabel. "What are you asking for them?" $2 a pound, she said. Wholesale. Glenn thought about this. $2 a pound was more than he paid for the Florida tomatoes. The Florida tomatoes were also, he knew perfectly well, inferior in every way that mattered to a person who intended to eat a tomato rather than look at one. He bought the flat. He called Mabel the following Tuesday to ask if she had more. She did. By March of 1982, Mabel Grundy was supplying fresh tomatoes and butterhead lettuce to 2 grocery stores in Castro County and 1 in Lamb County to the east. By April, she was at capacity, which was the constraint she had known she would hit. 40 by 60 feet of growing space is not a large operation. She was selling everything she grew before it was fully ripe because the demand outstripped what she could produce. In May of 1982, she planted her first outdoor drip-irrigated tomato beds on the east side of the equipment barn, using plastic mulch and row covers to extend the season on both ends. This was not a technology commonly used in Castro County in 1982. The drip tape had to be ordered from a supplier in California. The plastic mulch came from a vegetable farm catalog she had found in the university library in Lubbock. Clem installed the system over 4 days in late April with the focused intensity of a man who has decided that something he thought was foolish is actually interesting. "Miss Mabel," he said on the 3rd day of installation, "where did you learn to do this?" She handed him a stack of research papers from the University of California at Davis. He looked at the top paper. He looked at her. "You've been reading California farming papers, and Israeli ones," she said. "They've been doing drip irrigation in the Negev since the 1960s. Clem put the papers down and went back to the drip tape. By the fall of 1982, Mabel had supplemented her dryland cotton and sorghum income with just under $9,000 in fresh produce sales. For a 1,200-acre operation that had been netting between $14,000 and $20,000 total in a good cotton year, $9,000 from roughly half an acre of controlled environment growing was, by any agricultural standard, remarkable. She did not mention the numbers at the co-op. She did not mention them at the cafe. She had learned from watching Raymond that a farmer who discusses good years invites questions about bad ones. The word got around anyway. Not the numbers, the tomatoes. People talked about the tomatoes. A school cafeteria director in Hereford named Mrs. Kowalski had bought a flat in March and served them in the cafeteria and had 17 children ask where the tomatoes had come from, which had never happened before in the history of Castro County school lunch. She called Mabel in April and asked if she could supply the school. Mabel said she would try. By 1984, she was supplying 2 school districts, a hospital cafeteria in Plainview, 4 grocery stores, and 3 restaurants. She had added a second greenhouse on the north end of the barn, this one purpose-built, 30 by 80 feet, with a proper double-pulley inflated roof that she had priced out for 2 years before committing to it. She had hired a part-time worker, a young woman named Frances, who had grown up on a vegetable farm in the Rio Grande Valley and knew more about pest management and plant nutrition than anyone else in Castro County. Clem had become, by 1984, the best greenhouse hand in the Texas Panhandle, which was admittedly not a competitive field, but which represented a complete reversal of the man who had stood in that October yard in 1981 and looked at the flat brown horizon. The Cattlemen's Association in Dimmitt had a meeting in February of 1984 where someone brought up Mabel Grundy's operation as an example of agricultural diversification. A man named Bert Ashby, who had watched her buy that greenhouse from the fence line in 1981, said he didn't see how growing tomatoes had anything to do with serious farming. Mabel was not at the meeting. She was in the greenhouse checking the overnight temperature log. Let me tell you about the summer of 1988, because this is where 8 years of quiet, patient work met a test that nobody in the Texas Panhandle saw coming, and that the people who were farming the conventional way failed in very large numbers. The winter of 1987 came in dry. The spring of 1988 was drier. The soil moisture in March was at the lowest level the Extension Office had recorded since 1953. The cotton went in late because the ground was too hard to work and too dry to germinate seed reliably. By June, the forecast had not improved. By July, it was a disaster. The Panhandle had seen drought before, but the summer of 1988 combined drought with a heat that was specifically devastating to dryland cotton. Sustained temperatures above 100 degrees during the critical bolling period, which caused the cotton plants to shed their bolls before they matured. It didn't just reduce yields, it eliminated them. A field that should have produced 700 pounds of lint per acre was producing 80. Some fields were producing nothing at all. Castro County lost an estimated 40% of its cotton acreage to either failed germination or mid-season boll shed. Banks were calling operating loans. The Farm Service Agency office in Dimmitt was open on Saturdays. A farm family that had been working the same ground for 3 generations sat at that FSA office in August and learned that they did not have enough collateral to restructure their debt, and their options were to sell the land or walk away from it. Mabel Grundy's dryland cotton had not done well either. She knew in July that the cotton was not going to produce. She had seen it coming since April. She had already adjusted. This is the part that mattered. While her neighbors were watching their dryland fields turn to dust and making emergency calls to the bank, Mabel's greenhouses were producing on schedule. The greenhouses did not care what the July temperature was outside. The greenhouses did not care that it had not rained since March. They ran on well water and propane, and the management system Mabel had been refining for 7 years. Her outdoor, drip-irrigated beds were struggling in the heat, and she had lost a portion of her summer tomato crop to heat stress. But her fall planting was already in the ground under shade cloth, scheduled to begin producing in October, and her winter greenhouse crop was planned and resourced and not dependent on a single dollar of income from the dryland cotton fields that were failing across the county. When the cotton came in at 40% of normal yield, Mabel absorbed the loss. It reduced her total farm income by roughly $6,000. Her greenhouse operation that year netted just under $22,000. She finished 1988 in the black, not comfortably. But in the black, her neighbors did not. The feed store in Dimmitt closed in November 1988. The owner had been extended on his inventory loan and could not service it after a summer in which half his customers had no crop revenue. 2 farm families in the county sold land that fall at prices that would have been unthinkable in 1985. A co-op member who had farmed 20,400 acres of cotton in 2 counties retired that December at 61 years old because his operation could not survive another bad year, and he did not have the reserves to try. Bert Ashby came by Mabel's place in November. He stood in the door of the greenhouse for a long moment without saying anything. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit. Francis was working the far row, tying new growth to the trellis wire with practiced efficiency. The smell in the greenhouse was warm and green and entirely out of character with the gray November wind outside. "How?" he said. Mabel handed him a tomato. He ate it standing there. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "Since before Raymond died," she said. "Longer, maybe. I've been thinking about it since I was helping my mother in her kitchen garden. She could grow things in bad years that nobody else could grow. I spent a long time thinking about why." Bert turned the remaining piece of tomato in his hand. "I told people at the meeting in '84 that this wasn't serious farming." "I know." Mabel said it without edge. She said it the way her mother would have said it, which was without making a point of something that did not need to be made. "You should have argued with me," Bert said. "You wouldn't have listened in 1984. He had no answer for that. He stood there a while longer, looking at the plants. Clem was 67 years old that November. He had worked for the Grundy family for 28 years, first for Raymond, then for Mabel. He had built the second greenhouse with his own hands in 1983. He had learned drip irrigation from a manual and a California research paper. He had become, without exactly meaning to, one of the most knowledgeable, small-scale controlled environment growers in the Texas Panhandle, which was something he would never have predicted about himself in 1981 when he had stood in the yard and watched Mabel get out of her truck with her notebook. In December of 1988, he and Mabel were going over the spring planting schedule at the kitchen table, outside. The wind was doing what Panhandle wind does in December, which is everything it can to remind you that the land belongs to the weather. He looked up from the planting chart. "Your mother's garden," he said. "Was it big?" "Not very," Mabel said. "Maybe a quarter acre. But she got more out of it than men with 50 acres got out of their fields." Clem thought about this because she managed the soil, and she didn't bet everything on one thing. She grew 12 different vegetables. If the squash failed, the beans were fine. If the beans failed, the tomatoes came in. She never lost a whole year. Clem set down his pencil. "Raymond never understood that, did he?" "Raymond understood it fine," Mabel said. "He just didn't know how to apply it to 1,200 acres. And neither did I until I started reading." The Castro County Agricultural Extension Service published a report in the spring of 1989 surveying how local farms had performed through the 1988 drought. Mabel Grundy was one of 4 operations in the county that had remained profitable. The other 3 were large operations with deep water, rights, and federal crop insurance that had paid out substantially. Mabel was the only one who had remained profitable not because of insurance or reserves, but because a portion of her operation had been structurally insulated from the conditions that had destroyed the dryland crop. The extension agent, a thorough young man named Kevin, who had gone to Texas A&M and believed in data, drove out to Mabel's place in March of 1989 and spent an afternoon walking the operation. He asked her when she had started planning the greenhouse operation. She said 1975. He wrote that down. He asked where she had learned the controlled environment techniques she was using. She said university research papers, mostly from California and Israel. Israel. He wrote that down too. He asked what she would say to other small-scale dryland farmers in the Panhandle who were looking for a way to stabilize their income. She thought about it for a moment. I would say that one income stream is a bet, she said. And dryland farming in the Texas Panhandle is a bet you are going to lose about once every 10 years. You can insure the bet, or you can change the game. I changed the game. It cost me $4,000 and a lot of reading, and I would do it again starting tomorrow. Kevin published those words in the Extension Service report. An editor at the Amarillo Globe News picked up the report and called Mabel for a longer interview. The interview ran in April 1989. By June, Mabel had received letters from farm women in 6 states. She answered everyone. Mabel Grundy ran her greenhouse operation and her dryland fields together on those 1,200 acres until 2001, when she was 58. She handed the operation to her daughter, Patricia. No, that name is taken. Her daughter, whose name was Cecilia, taken too. Her daughter Carol, who had spent her summers learning the sand and the soil and the planting schedules since she was old enough to read a thermometer, took over the full operation in the fall of 2001. The greenhouse is still there. The second one is still there. A third was added in 1996. Carol expanded the produce sales to include farmers' markets in Lubbock and Amarillo, which Mabel had thought about but never had the time to execute. The drip irrigation on the outdoor beds is in its 4th generation of equipment. The soil in the raised beds, which Mabel had started amending in November 1981, with feedlot compost and patience, is now some of the most biologically active topsoil in Castro County, tested by the Extension Service in 2007 and found to have organic matter levels 3 times the county average. In 2003, Texas A&M's Agricultural Extension Program invited Mabel to speak at a diversified farming conference in College Station. She was 60 years old. She had never spoken at a conference in her life. She almost declined. Carol told her she had to go. Mabel stood at the podium with a folded piece of paper she had written her notes on during the drive. She looked at it once and then put it in her pocket. People ask me why I started growing vegetables in a greenhouse in the middle of dryland cotton country. That is the wrong question. The right question is why everyone else in the Panhandle was farming one crop in one climate and calling it a business plan. She paused. My mother grew 12 vegetables on a 1/4 acre. She never lost a whole year. In 40 years of dryland cotton, my county has never figured out what my mother knew by instinct, that a farm that depends on one thing depends on the weather, and the weather in the Texas Panhandle does not owe you anything. She paused again. I bought a broken greenhouse for $2,400 in 1981. I read papers from California and Israel about growing food in desert climates, and I applied what I learned to flat cotton country in West Texas. I made mistakes for 2 years, and then I stopped making them. In 1988, while my county was failing, I was finishing the year in the black, not because I was smarter than my neighbors, because I had read some papers and taken them seriously. The room was quiet when she stepped down, and then it was not. Bert Ashby had driven up from Dimmitt for the conference. July. He was 71 years old and had been running sheep alongside his cotton since 1990. An idea he had gotten from talking to a man at the extension office who had heard about what Mabel had done and started thinking about diversification in his own operation. Bert had not mentioned to anyone in Castro County that it was Mabel's greenhouse that had made him start thinking differently, because he had not figured out how to say it without admitting he had been wrong at that meeting in 1984. He found her in the lobby afterward. $2,400, he said. $2,400, she said. And some papers from California and some papers from Israel. Bert took off his hat. He looked at it the way men look at things that have been with them through a lot of weather. Your mother's garden, he said. My mother's garden, Mabel said. That's where it started. That's where it started. And it started there because my mother never once believed that the way things were done was the same as the way things had to be done. She grew what the soil wanted to grow. She managed what she could manage, and she didn't bet what she couldn't afford to lose. I just scaled it up and put a glass roof on it. Bert nodded slowly. I told you in '84 it wasn't serious farming. You did. You should have argued. You had to see the 1988 numbers yourself, Mabel said. Some things you can't be told. You have to watch them happen. I knew that. That's why I never argued. She smiled at him. What do you see when you look at a broken greenhouse on a dead man's property in October? Bert thought about it honestly. I see a demolition problem and a waste of somebody's time. That's what everyone saw, Mabel said. I saw a south-facing 40 by 60 glass structure in the highest sunlight county in Texas that someone had already paid to build and that nobody was using. I saw 6 months of winter produce demand with zero local supply. I saw $2,400 and a lot of reading and 10 years of patience. She put her hat on. Everyone else saw garbage. That's the only difference between us. I wasn't smarter. I was just looking at different things. Mabel Grundy paid $2,400 for a greenhouse nobody wanted. She moved it to her property, fixed it with salvaged glass and second-hand equipment, and a propane heater from a nursery in Amarillo, and grew tomatoes in the Texas Panhandle in February. She added a second greenhouse, then a third. She built a customer base from 2 grocery stores to 2 school districts to a hospital cafeteria to farm women, writing letters from 6 states. She came through the drought of 1988 in the black, while her county lost 40% of its cotton. She built a soil, in those raised beds, that was still deepening 30 years after she first turned compost into it. They said you couldn't grow fresh produce in the winter in Castro County. She grew it. And when the summer of 1988 finally came, the one that tested every dryland farmer in the Panhandle at once, they understood what Mabel had known since she was a girl following her mother through a kitchen garden in Dimmitt, Texas. A farm is not a bet you place once a year and wait to collect. It is a system you build between soil and water, between what the land wants to grow and what your customers need to buy, between the things you can control and the things you cannot afford to leave to chance. $2,400. A broken greenhouse. A rancher's daughter who had been watching her mother's quarter-acre produce miracles since, before she knew the word for what her mother was doing. The greenhouse nobody wanted. On the farm of the woman nobody understood until they saw what her numbers looked like in the worst summer anyone in Castro County could remember.